Welcome to Anatomy Lab virtually. Today we're working with rats. And so what we're going to do is dissect a male and a female rat and look inside them to see what their organs look like and where they are. And they're actually remarkably similar to humans in what our organs look like and where they are. So this will be a cheaper way to look inside and see what things look like. We have here our dissecting tray. We have forceps, scalpel, dissecting probes, and our rats. So we have a female here and a male here. You would have gotten one of those in a real classroom. And we have our gloves on. So let's go ahead and get them opened up. We'll lay them both out next to each other here and see what we have going on. We do a really good job on the shrink wrapping of these things so they don't want to come out easily. So that was probably the hardest part of our dissection, was getting them out of the packaging. When we lay them side by side here, externally you can tell the difference in gender by looking between the hind legs. So here we have a female, so we don't really see anything particular there. This specimen is a male, and if we look here, we actually have the scrotum, and the testes would be inside the scrotum. So here in the female, you don't see that. When we take the skin off, then we'll be able to see things a little bit more clearly. So let's start with the male. And what we want to do is we want to open it up. So we'll start here and get the skin opened up just a little bit. When doing this in real life, you do want to be careful because they are injected with a fair bit of chemicals and you don't want that to splash out. Slice the skin down to both legs here, and that will help keep things open without having to pin it in place. It'll just sort of open up for us here. We'll go ahead and open up, this was the male, so we'll go ahead and open up the scrotum here so we can see the testes inside all at the same time here. So here's the abdominal cavity for the rat. One of the first things probably that jumps out at you is the liver. The liver is the largest single organ here inside the rat. So we see the multiple lobes here of the liver. Pretty good size amount of tissue there. And the job of the liver is to assist in digestion and metabolism. So a lot of digestion going on in living things. It makes sense that it's a large thing. Over here on this side we have some stuff that looks sort of like liver, but it's darker red in color. This is actually the spleen. And then what we're otherwise seeing here is small intestines, and then we get over here a little bit further into large intestines, and we'll look at those closer when we pull things out. So what we're going to do right now is pull out this entire group of organs here, so that we can sort of sort them out. So I have to get in here and slice. I'll get my fingers out of the way in a minute. There's only so precise you can be on these things. So now we've removed all of the abdominal organs here in this chunk. Before we get into those, let's go ahead and go down here and look at the testicles. So we'll go ahead and remove the testicle from the scrotum. So here we have a testicle. There's one on the other side here as well. those would connect together and go inside. And for a rat, they're small enough that the internal reproductive anatomy besides the testicles is a little bit tricky to sort out, so we won't worry about that so much. But the testicles here are pretty significant and easy to find. So definitely a male here. Let's go back over here to our abdominal organs. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to sort of get it all separated out here into separate pieces. There is all the liver. You can see it consists of multiple lobes and pieces there. So quite a good sized mass of stuff. I'll go ahead back over here and remove the spleen. So there's the spleen. That's going to be involved primarily in the functioning of the lymphatic and immune systems. So that's an important part of things if the individual happens to be sick. Most of what we have left here is digestive system. So here's a really nice view of the stomach. And what we see coming out at the top here is actually esophagus. So food would have come from the rat's mouth down the esophagus here and entered the stomach. And you can see the esophagus enters the stomach at about halfway down the stomach. So, stomach. From the stomach we go to small intestines. And I'm going to work on carefully, hopefully without tearing things, sort of unraveling the intestines here. They're actually stuck together, you see very nicely here, to keep them all in one mass. But if we're careful, we should be able to unwind the digestive system and get it into one nice long strand. So inside your abdominal cavity, your small intestines are all held together just like this. Helps keep them in one mass even though they do quite a bit of flopping around inside. So here we have the stomach, small intestines. You can see here quite a few small intestines here. If we stretch these out, we've probably got almost 2 feet of small intestines here. And then when we go from small intestines to large, there's a very obvious change that occurs here. So we're going from small thin tubing to a much thicker tubing here, which is then where fecal material will be formed. And relative to the small intestines, the large intestines are pretty short. So where it does this dramatic change, you know you're in large intestines, then it would go out here at this point, would exit the anus. What we have hiding here in the back are the kidneys. So they look just like kidney beans, and that's where kidney beans got their name from, is they look just like kidneys. And those were actually located up here in the rat cavity, just underneath the rib cage at the back side. Obviously, the kidney's job is to filter the blood and produce urine. So that's the organs of the abdominal cavity. We have one more interesting cavity we can go into here and find some more organs, and that's up here in the thoracic cavity. So in the thoracic cavity, we're going to find lungs and heart. This is a little bit more work to get into because you have ribs there. So we'll work on getting this cut open so that it will stay open a little bit. So here we have the thoracic cavity that's opening up nicely. And what we would see here is here we have the heart right here in the middle. And then we have lungs on each side. So here's the right lung and here's the left lung. Remember, to you, this is looking like the left is the right and the right is the left, but anatomical position. So in this case, from the rat's perspective, this is the rat's right lung, this is the rat's left lung, with the heart sitting here in the middle. So we might be able to remove that whole chunk of organs in one piece here if we get a little bit lucky. There we go. So here we see lungs, and if we flip it around from the back side, so we see the heart inside the lungs. And let's take a look at the lungs themselves. And what we've been seeing a lot of in rats lately is very unhealthy lungs. So we'll take the heart out here. So there's the heart by itself. And if you see the little darker reddish structures towards the left side here, those are actually the atria. And then the rest of the heart, the bottom part here, is the ventricles. So the atria are somewhat disconnected from the rest of the heart. So if we look at the lungs here, what we immediately see is some discoloration. So you're seeing the darker pink structure or color, that's the way it's supposed to be, but you see all these lighter colored nodules in here. And so it looks like the lungs are pretty full of those nodules. They're not supposed to be there. So that's indicating some sort of respiratory problem that we're seeing a lot of these rats have. I wouldn't necessarily call it lung cancer, but certainly some sort of lung problem there. We would like to see all of the lungs be this little bit darker red color with no light chunks or nodules in it. So that's the lungs, and you can see that each lung actually has multiple lobes to it, just like we saw with the liver. The thoracic cavity was separated from the abdominal cavity by the diaphragm. And we can see a little bit of the diaphragm here that we tore when we opened up the thoracic cavity. We can see the ribs on the inside there and running down the middle at the back here, the vertebrae. So those are the internal organs that are visible in us and visible in a rat. And in both us and the rat, there are other pieces in there, other organs too, but in rat size, they're so small that being able to tell what they are and appreciate them is quite difficult. So what you've seen is what is easy to find, and obviously the bigger your specimen, the easier it is to find some of those smaller parts. A lot of you, if we were in the lab, would have had great interest in cutting open the skull and removing the brain. And sometimes with careful dissection, that's possible to remove the brain from the skull. But again, these guys are so small that it's really, really tricky. And the brain is quite soft and squishy. So I doubt that I would be able to do it here on a video to any level of success. But do know that occasionally people are able to pull that off with some careful work. So that was the male. Let's go back to the female, and the internal structures for the most part on the female are going to be the same. A stomach looks like a stomach, and it doesn't necessarily matter which gender it happens to be a part of. But when we get to the reproductive system, that's where we find some differences. So let me go ahead and get this sliced open here. So when we open the abdominal cavity here, everything looks pretty much the same, because at the front side here, everything is exactly the same. What we'll do is we'll remove, just like we do with the other one, we'll remove this liver, stomach, intestines complex so that we can see the reproductive structures underneath. So now we have the digestive system removed. Here you can see the kidneys still in place on this rat, so that's their natural position right there. But the reproductive system internally for a female doesn't involve testes, it does involve a uterus. And a uterus in a rat is where you find a difference between humans and rats, or really any animal that is designed to give birth to one baby at a time compared to any animal that is designed to give birth to litters. So what I'm doing right here is I'm actually lifting the forked uterus. So it has a forked uterus, meaning that here's one fork of the uterus right here. And the yellow blobby stuff you see is fat. So the actual uterus itself is this pink tube. Pretend the fat's not there. So one of those on each side. And I have seen rats have up to about 15 or 16 babies per rat. Would be spaced out along these forks of the uterus on each side. So that would give space to separate those babies out as far from each other as you could. It's still quite cramped in there, but that's a lot better than in a human. In a human, the uterus is more compact because it's just designed really to hold one baby at a time. Occasionally twins happen and that can work. Occasionally triplets can happen and that can work. But the more babies you try to stick in a human uterus all at once, the less likely that any one of them will actually turn out and survive. Because we're designed for one at a time, not litters. So this is clearly a female who has never been pregnant because those uterine tubes are very small. If this rat had ever been pregnant, those tubes would be much larger in diameter because they would have been stretched out by having babies in there. And just for reference, right before a baby rat is born, it's a little bit bigger than one of these kidneys. So imagine somewhere between 10 and 16 of these kidneys stuffed into these tubes along the way, and that's the mama rat in the last week or so of her pregnancy. And when they're actually born, they'll be a little bit bigger than these kidneys. So again, 8 times these number of kidney-sized structures in here stuffed inside those tubes, pretty tight. So no doubt mama rat is very happy to have given birth and feel much better afterwards. So that's a female rat. And now we have looked at rats and their internal anatomy. And again, the only real difference between them is the reproductive system in the female is a forked uterus rather than in a human is a single compact uterus. And in a human, the large intestines would circle the abdominal cavity, whereas in the rat, they were just stuffed off down here on the bottom. Everything else you've seen is pretty much exactly like it would be in a human, both in appearance and in relative size to everything else, and in where it's located. So, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.